So, good morning, everybody. I will continue on the chapter about fertility, and we reach this point here, which we will talk a little bit about the levels and trends of fertility in the US. So, the US experienced in these last centuries and decades really sharp declines in total fertility rate. So the overall number of children per woman dropped from 7 to around 4 between 1800 and 1900. And in the early 20th century, fertility continued to decline. And this is really associated with major changes that the society has been passing through, and we have been discussing throughout this course. So the US has also been experiencing rapid economic transition, industrialization, and urbanization that overall affect mortality. Mortality declines a lot. So people realize they don't have to have as many children to survive to adult ages. And also when we live in urban areas, it's more expensive to have children, to provide good education, good housing, and so on. So fertility keeps declining. And it's the total fertility rate now in the US is just around 2, like below 2 children per woman. So it's below the replacement level now. And in the 50s, kind of like reached this peak of 3.7 children per woman, but it has been declining ever since. But when we compare the US with other developed countries, still the rate of natural increase is 0.4%. It's around, or it was 4.4% back in 2014. I mean, the point here is not, this data is 8 years old, right, from 2014. But the point here is just to make that still the level of fertility in the US is higher on average than in other developed countries. So the overall differential between people being born and dying divided by the size of the population in the US, the rate of natural increase, is still higher than in these other developed countries. We also saw in that one of the initial chapters of this course, where we focus also on different demographic indicators in the US, by showing that the US, the total fertility rate is higher than in other developed countries. And because of that, people being born minus people dying, and relative to the population, you have a rate of natural increase higher in the US than in these other countries. At the same time, we see an improvement in mortality. So mortality has been declining over time, and that has been generating a higher percentage of people in older ages. Specifically about adolescent fertility. Adolescent fertility is the age-specific fertility rate estimated for women between the ages of 15 and 19, so women who had children between those ages. And why do we care about adolescent fertility so much? There are so many studies trying to understand it. Because when women, they have children at earlier ages, such as 15 and 19, that can have impact on several aspects of their lives later on. So women who usually start having children early in life, they end up having more children overall. So they have a higher number of children ever born. They tend to drop out from school. So adolescent fertility is closely associated with women dropping out from high school. So premature ending of to schooling. So the likelihood of this woman going to college declines a lot. And related to that, by them not investing in education because of already being mothers, that has an impact on their economic potential, right? So they, in the future, the jobs that they might get will tend to have lower earnings. And related to that, so lower education, lower earnings, they will have fewer resources to invest into their children. So their children might experience worse health outcomes compared to other children of women who usually have children at older ages. Just to give you an idea about the numbers, the adolescent fertility rate, based on data from 2005 and 2010, so out of 1,000 women aged 15 and 19 in the world, 48.9 of them had birth in that period. In developed countries, that number is much lower, 23.6 women in this age group. Out of 1,000 of them had children in that period between 2005 and 2010. And in developing countries, as we would expect, higher rates of adolescent fertility, 52.7. And that's exactly because in a lot of developing countries, still women don't have access to contraceptives, they don't have access to information, and it's still really sexist society. So women don't have the potential to control or to plan, to better plan their family, right? And when they have children and so on. But even if you compare countries within those developed countries, you see the adolescent fertility rate in Switzerland is really low. In the US, it's actually higher than the average of developed countries, 39.7. In Bulgaria, 42.1. And again, in developing countries, it also varies a lot. Data from North Korea indicates only 0.6 of adolescent fertility rate for every 1,000 women in between the ages of 15 and 19. In Niger, much higher adolescent fertility rate, 209.6 for birth for every 1,000 women between the ages of 15 and 19. So all these studies, they try to estimate those and look at the trends within countries over time, because the incidence of adolescent fertility might have potential and important impacts on the lives of these women. So here is just more broken down for different sub-areas of the world. So this number here of the world, we saw here 48.9. That's the number of adolescent fertility rate. Developing countries higher than average, developed countries lower than average. But you also see, for example, Sub-Saharan Africa, Middle Africa, Western Africa, Eastern Africa, really high levels of adolescent fertility. And Western Europe, Southern Europe, Eastern Asia, Australia, New Zealand with the lowest level. And as a continent, as a whole, Europe has the lowest levels of adolescent fertility, right? Exactly because women can better plan. Whenever they want to have children, they have access to contraceptives, they have access to information within the household and also from health services. So the adolescent fertility specifically in the US has been declining since the 1940s. And what demographers have been indicating is that this decline is associated with the increase of use of contraception. And among teenagers, there's a significant increase in the percentage of births to unmarried teenagers. So among those between the ages of 15 and 19 who have children, the majority of them nowadays are not married. Why is that important? Because usually women who are not married don't have the partner, might not have the partner living in the household, and then they will suffer even more economic hardship. But we also talk here that we see an increase in cohabitation rates, and in the US that's really clear. So a lot of these women might not be formally married, but they still have their partner living with them in the household. So not necessarily all these women having births and not being married, they might still have someone with them in the household giving some sort of support. So just to give an idea, back in 1940, out of all teenage women who had births, only 14% of them were unmarried. So a more traditional society, women marry earlier, have children earlier, and so on. But also compromise their education, so levels of education attainment are lower for women in those decades. And then in more recent years, 2013, out of all adolescents in the US who had children between the ages of 15 and 19, 89% of them were unmarried. But again, are they living with their parents? Are they living with a partner in a cohabitation? That is not explained by this number here. You're just saying that they are not formally married. But usually people who are formally married have better socioeconomic status in the household, right, overall. And fertility of younger teenagers and older teenagers, they also vary. So whenever we are talking about adolescent fertility between the ages of 15 and 19, if you have more refined data in order to break it down, the subgroup, it would be good to analyze the adolescent fertility for women between the ages of 15 and 17 and 18 and 19. And based on this data from the US, again from 2013, you see that younger women, those between the ages of 15 and 17, in that year, around 12 out of 1,000 of them had children between the ages of 15 and 17. And this number is much higher. Out of 1,000 women between the ages of 18 and 19, 47.3 of them had children, right? So when we are talking about adolescent fertility, we also have to have in mind that the chances of women having children between the ages of 18 and 19 is much higher than between the ages of 15 and 17. Also, as in the US, socioeconomic and demographic indicators vary a lot by race. And that's the same thing about adolescent fertility. Among Asian and Pacific Islander women, out of 1,000 of them between the ages of 15 and 19, 7.7 only had children back in 2014, while among Hispanics, that number was higher. It is related to socioeconomic status, but it's also related to culture as well, right? So there are like different things going on here to explain this variation in adolescent fertility by race ethnicity. Here is just the trends of adolescent fertility broken down by the younger teenagers, 15 to 17, and the older teenagers, 18 to 19. Overall, the levels of adolescent fertility falling, and that being a good sign, because then it might be an indication that these women are investing in their education, going on to college, having good jobs before they reach out, before they get married and have children, right? But still here, we're talking women in high school ages and starting college. But what's interesting, we see these declining trends in adolescent fertility, and that's a good indicator that this woman might be able to have a better economic lifestyle in the future and a better health for their children, as we talked before, right? So the rate broken down by race ethnicity, and also for different years, 1991 2007, 2013, 2014. Overall, trends declining, and this is for the whole group, 15 to 19. And then you see that Hispanic teenagers, they usually have more children than other groups, but back in 1991, actually, the group that had the highest adolescent fertility rates were non-Hispanic Black women. But then by 2007, the rates of non-Hispanic Black teenagers dropped below those of the Hispanic population, right? Of a Hispanic teenage woman. So overall, Hispanic, higher, non-Hispanic, Black, followed by American Indian, Alaska Natives, non-Hispanic white, and the lowest rates among Asian or Pacific Islander. And but within each race ethnicity group, you see declines over time. And there are also some studies, even with like more recent data, showing that adolescent fertility among Hispanic women has been declining even more and reaching closer to the other race ethnicity groups, right? And they have not been so much higher as they were before comparing to these other groups, or much higher, for example, back here in 2007, comparing to these other groups. So because a lot of these Hispanic teenagers, they are actually born in the US and they are being exposed to the American culture, to the American possibilities of education and jobs. So the lifestyle changes compared to their relatives who were born outside of the US, right? Their relatives being either parents or grandparents or whatever a generation that was. But then they start to integrate more into the American culture. So you have a decline in adolescent fertility among Hispanic women as well. Of course, a lot of those are US born, they're American citizens and living here for their whole life. Another topic, it's NoMarital Fertility. That's the fertility of women who are not married, they are widowed or divorced, and it is fertility of women in those marital status used to be called illegitimate fertility. But of course, in our current society, fertility outside of the marriage is more acceptable now. And again, are we talking about marital status in a normative way in discourse? No. I'm not saying that's good to be married, that's the goal of everybody. It's not the point. It's just an analysis of empirical data that usually married women, they have better financial, social, and emotional resources. So doing the analysis of fertility by marital status might show us some interesting trends about that population. So back in 2013, 41% of non-marital births out of the total number of, in 2013, we had 41% out of all births, they were non-marital births, and the other 59% were births of women who were married, and 41% they were not married, or they were widowed or divorced. And this 41%, still you have 59% of births back in 2013 of women who were married, but this 41%, it's a huge increase compared to the 4% back in 1940. So back in 1940, only 4% of the births were out of women who were not married, widowed, or divorced. Again, differentials by race ethnicity. Asians, they have the lowest levels of non-marital fertility. 17% of all Asian births only are non-marital fertility, and 17% considering the denominator, the Asian births, right? Not the all births of all women. And for Blacks, they have the highest levels of non-marital fertility, out of all births of African-American women, 71% are from those who are not married or widowed or divorced. And non-marital births include births to women in cohabiting unions and unmarried women not cohabiting, right? So when we are talking here about non-marital births, women might have their partner living at home. That's something that's emphasized a lot throughout the textbook. The 71% here, it is shocking, but we have to understand that a lot of these women might have some sort of financial, social, and emotional support at home because they might have a partner living with them. But that partner is not formally married, and but they might be cohabiting, right? But these 71% also include women who are not married and they are not cohabiting. So it includes both. Unmarried in both cases, but some ones might be cohabiting, have some sort of support from the partner, and others are not cohabiting. And not cohabiting, are they living with their parents? That's also not broken down here. This information is not given by this specific indicator, okay? So it's just to show you that these numbers are informative, they show trends, they show differentials by race, ethnicity, but still, if you want to understand in depth the situation of non-marital fertility, of women and fertility trends in the US, you have to keep digging. You have to keep getting more refined data. And here are the overall numbers of births, birth rate, and percentage of births to unmarried women. So the overall number of births, we see it's increasing. This, the light blue line and the dark blue line are kind of like similar to a graph that I showed previously in this course, kind of show the overall number of births increasing over time. And this data here from 1940 to 2013. But this is only the numerator of the formula of birth rate. In order to kind of actually a better trend, we have to get this number of births divided by the size of the female population in reproductive ages to get the birth rate, right? And then we see, yeah, you might have seen an increase here in the mid-2000s, but then it's increasing into the same levels as it was, for example, in the 90s. And this number here is still misleading because it's declining, but it's here still higher than in the 90s. But this is only the numerator of the formula. Here we actually have a rate, okay? And the overall percentage of women having children and being unmarried has been increasing over time. That's the green curve here, okay? So this vertical axis here on the right is for number of births, and here on the left is related to birth rate and to the percentage of women who are having births not being formally married, okay? So this is just, the previous slides just gives an overview, and here we kind of see the trends over time. And also related to cultural changes, being more acceptable for women to cohabit, to have children when they are not formally married. It's now also more acceptable, culturally speaking, not so much pressure as before, at least in some environments, for women decided to don't have children at all. So childlessness, this term refers of women having no children, either voluntarily or involuntarily. Involuntarily might be biological reasons, there is no control there, but voluntarily, that's the changes that we try to usually see related to different norms or different habits, different overall cultural norms going on in the country. So voluntary childlessness, almost non-existent between 1950s and 1960s. And then we see an increase in childlessness since the 1970s in the country, and mainly due to voluntary childlessness. Attitudes and norms towards childlessness become more positive overall with changes in gender norms. So now with an increase in female labor force participation, some women might decide to don't have children at all to keep moving forward in their career because they would jeopardize their goals if they had children because they would have to spend time and resources raising children. Okay. And this is just one simple graph showing the percentage rates of childlessness for women age 30 to 44. And then in the graph here between 1976 and 2012, we break it down by 3 sub-age groups, 30 to 34, 35 to 39, and 40 to 44. The first thing that you see in the 3 curves is kind of an increase over time, right? Those women between 30 to 34, you see an increase in the percentage of those not having children at all between those ages. The same thing, 30 to 35 and 35 to 39. And then you see a little decline by the last period shown in the graph, like 2012. But these women here who are 30 to 34, for example, in 2010, they might not have children, but they might have children as soon as they go to the next age group here in this graph, for example. Maybe they decide to have children when they are 30 to 35 to 39, or when they are 40 to 44, right? So that is not saying that these women here that were measured at this time would never have children. Just saying that the trend of women in those ages of not having children at all has been increasing over time. And this graph is also talking about that postponement in fertility, right? It could be this woman here, 30 to 34, are not having children at this age, but they might decide to have children in older ages. The question is, whenever they decide to have children, will they reach the desired number of children that they would like to have? That's a major question. If they don't reach that desired number, then the overall fertility in the long term might decline in the country, right? And you see that 40 to 44, by the oldest age group available here in this graph, this percentage of those women not having children kind of increased up to the mid-90s, but then it has been around 18, 20%. It doesn't change as much, right? So maybe what's going on, what this graph is showing more, is a postponing fertility than actually an overall increase on only childlessness. It seems, I mean, this number here for 40 to 44, around 18, 20%, kind of stable there, declined a little bit in 2012, but around that range, like let's say 16, 20%. Cool. And then the last topic in the fertility chapter that we will cover here, it's related to male fertility. Male fertility is rarely examined in fertility studies for several reasons, right? One of them is biological. There is a wider range of childbearing years for males, but usually men can have children between the ages of 15 and 79. So that's much wider age range compared to women. The standard that we use in demography for women between the ages of 15 and 49. So in theoretical, there is no limitation on the number of children that men can have. And in developing countries, you could see societies that men have multiple partners. So their overall levels of fertility, if you measure from the male point of view, might be higher than the one from a measure with fertility information from women. Another thing that has been inhibiting studies about male fertility is actually methodological. There is less data availability for males than females. It's like, in other words, like Father's Day is often missing on birth registration certificates. Again, in a more sexist societies in developing countries, or even in developed countries in previous decades, maybe you didn't have information about the father in birth certificates. And also, it was a methodological decision to compare several countries over time, is to get data that's available for all these countries for a long period of time. And that data on fertility is more reliable from women. And on average, too, when you ask women how many children they had in their life, the reporting of how many children they have is much more reliable when it comes from women than from men, right? And it's, again, exactly because of the childbearing, raising children in previous societies, they all fell on the shoulders of women. And related to that, there is a sociological reason. Males often regarded as breadwinners, not really close into raising children, with little involvement in fertility except for impregnating women. So no questions asked about fertility to men, and that information not being available for several countries. And also because it would be hard to follow men in all these different age groups to measure their fertility, the level of the number of studies dealing with male fertility is really small compared to studies about female fertility. But what the textbook emphasizes is that it's necessary to increase our understanding of male fertility. And it's necessary also because now men are more involved on raising children as well, and on making decisions about how many children the family will have as a whole, right? So all these changes that we have passing through, we start to ask questions about why some men have more children than the other, and it's necessary to collect more data about it and do more studies about it. So the textbook in the short subsection of the chapter discusses these three topics related to why male fertility is important. First, there is greater variance of fertility within males than within women. Marriage is a fertility determinant. Whether men and women are married, that will determine their fertility, and that varies by men and women. And there are different patterns of male fertility as well. Some men having a lot of children, some men having no children, okay? So let's just discuss each one of these 3 points. Greater variance within males. The greater variance of fertility within males contributed, so pretty much like men, if we look at fertility within men, there is much more variation in fertility among them than among women. And so the greater variance contributed by the male sex and the female sex to the next generation, it's really clear in our societies. We just show in the previous slides the percentage of childlessness women increasing over time, the percentage of women not wanting to have children at all, right? In that graph that I showed, around 20% of women between the ages of 40 to 44 not having children at all. But overall, most women have children. Most women have children. Among men, the chances of not having children at all is much higher than among women. On the other hand, in some societies, some men have really large numbers of children. So there's much greater variance among men, some of them not having children at all, some of them having a lot of children, while women, you have less variance, right? Of course, you still have women having more children than others, and some women not having children at all, but this variance is much is not so wide as we see among men. The second topic, male fertility is likely to be influenced by marital status and by employment status. Married employed men usually have higher number of children ever born. So when we saw those trends of total fertility rate by year in the US being really associated with economic changes. So right after World War II, you have economic development in the country, a lot of job opportunities, you have the baby boom, increasing fertility. And then you see economic crisis in the 1970s. In 2008, on the Great Recession, then you see declines in fertility. As we expect now, because of the pandemic, we expect declines in fertility as we talked before. And the effect of these economic oscillations, like increasing and declining economic trends in the countries, have a stronger effect on fertility of men than on fertility of women, okay? And also, married men are more likely to have children than unmarried men. And the difference between married men and unmarried men, this variation is much wider than among women. And we also know that there are some different patterns of male fertility compared to women. Age-specific fertility beginning a little later among men, usually around 18 years of age instead of 15, like women. Age-specific fertility stopping much later among men than among women. 79 years of age, as I showed before, compared to the standard that we get for women of 49. And male total fertility rates are higher than total fertility rates for women, especially in countries with total fertility rates higher than 2.2. Which are the countries nowadays with total fertility rates higher than 2.2 children per woman? Are exactly developing countries. And developing countries tend to have a more sexist society in which still childbearing activities are all supposed to be done by women. And a lot of these countries too, we see men with multiple partners. Because of that, male fertility is higher among men in those countries than among women, okay? Cohabitation patterns also vary by sex. There is a higher tendency of women to cohabit than men. This difference is more evident among women who previously lived alone. So if you have women that left their relatives, their parents' house for some reason, they are more likely to cohabit later on than women that live with their parents. Maybe they go to college and then right after they get married. Women who are foreign born are more likely to cohabit than women that are not, that are born in the US. Women who live in fragmented families, families that you see some like divorce families, for example, in those families, women who live in those families, later on, they have higher chances of cohabit than women who lived in a household, in a family that their parents were married for the whole time, okay? Also, we see different marriage and fertility patterns by sex. There is stronger negative effects of educational attainment on fertility among women compared to men. So going to school, having higher education, going to college and graduate degree, that has a stronger negative effect on fertility of women than on fertility of men. So education has a stronger effect on declining fertility of women than men. On the other hand, more economic indicator, unemployment is related to men's postponement of marriage. So if men are unemployed, they will tend to postpone their marriage, and that also influences postponing having children. And there is stronger religion effect among women than men. Among religious, more religious groups, even from the same groups, women who are more religious, they tend to have fewer children than, they tend to have more children than men who are more religious. So like religion in this case, having a positive effect on fertility with the idea of procreation and so on, right? So, but this, for religious groups, exactly those people, women are more influenced by religion than men, okay? Each one of these topics deserves analysis, understanding the influence of religion on fertility broken down by sex, the influence of the economic situation of a country on fertility broken down by sex, influence of education on fertility broken down by sex, influence of marriage on fertility broken down by sex, and also cohabitation, as we saw before. So all these analyses about the effects of religion on fertility, about economic on fertility, education on fertility, cohabitation on fertility, NoMarital fertility, a lot of studies have been doing this for female fertility, but not as many for male fertility, right? And that's what the textbook mentions, that we need more research, right? Much more is needed to incorporate gender studies into demography, understand why religion has a strong effect among women, why economic labor outcomes have a strong effect among men in terms of fertility. Education has strong effects among women, and so on. And we have to bring up this debate because that we are trying to understand what are the norms, what is the behavior of men and women in relation to these changes that are going on in society and influence their fertility, all right? So this was the chapter about fertility. And now we start the chapter on mortality. So here in our course website, we have the lecture for mortality. And this is just an article from the New York Times talking about child mortality. The child mortality has been declining overall in the world. I just like to look at the New York Times sometimes, I mean, because they kind of like get information from different sources and they make these really nice graphs, really animated, easy to understand. And then you see here, for example, child mortality over time declining, right? Going from red to blue in this case. And yeah, so that's why this, and this is actually an article from 2019. The US life expectancy decreased after 2014, another short article as well. And this is related to the opioid crisis that we experienced in the US. We still have been experiencing these effects on mortality. And so there's an academic paper discussing about it. But as I showed already in our course, we see that the pandemic itself is now having additional negative effects on mortality. So the CDC estimated a decline of life expectancy at birth in the US of 1.5 years between 2019 and 2020. And those researchers from the Max Planck Institute in Demography in Rostock, Germany, estimated around 2 years of decline, right? So that's a bad sign that the US was already experiencing declines in life expectancy since 2014 because of another issue, because of opioid crisis, and that can be even make it stronger because of the pandemic, right? So that's just another article that you have here. This is just a Netflix documentary about Bill Gates. I mean, why would I have a link here to advertise a billionaire? I mean, my only point to put this link here is just because there is a discussion within this part one of the documentary. I did not see all the other parts, is that his foundation is kind of trying to promote the development of technology to provide cheaper and better sanitation to developing countries. Because usually sanitation requires like this huge investments from the government, right? You have to build all this, the sewer system on the ground, and you have to have the facilities to treat the water and so on. Even here in College Station, just like in these last few years, we saw that water system being built in the Lee Creek Park, and the park as a whole for several years was having all those pipes underneath because of the increase in the neighborhoods in the south of College Station, in the Pebble Creek neighborhood and so on. So that demands a lot of investment. It's still going on. They're still building. I run in that park and I still see a lot of construction going on. That's a lot of money, right? And what he was trying to do here in this documentary, that's reported in the documentary, that he was just trying to come up with a technology that it would treat the sewer, but without to have this expensive sewer system being built in these countries. He was just trying to make people come up with some more chemical solutions for that. And it's interesting to watch it, right? And then some more methodological material here. This example of standardization, some examples of how we have to take into account age structure of countries. Some countries might have younger age structure and some countries have old age structures, and I want to compare mortality. The countries that have old age structure, they have higher chance of dying because they're older. And how do I compare mortality of these two countries with different age structures? We can use this methodology called standardization of mortality rates. Another way, if I want to compare mortality levels of different countries with different age structure, I can get age-specific mortality rates and calculate life expectancy at birth and life expectancy at all age groups. And we do it with life table. I mentioned life table too since the first lecture when I was talking about that tweet by Elon Musk, right? When we were talking about life table since then. And now I'm going to show exactly how to calculate life expectancy using life tables. And some more extra readings. And this SmartPack is pretty much a software package from the United Nations that help estimate mortality rates. But if you want to do analysis about mortality in the US, even broken down by state, by counties, you have a lot of that data available in the Census Bureau website, right? Cool. So just going then into the mortality chapter. So all that material you can download in the course website. Here, give you an introduction, overall introduction about main indicators and concepts in mortality. Then we're going to go into a more methodological part of the mortality chapter. How can we compare mortality levels in countries that have different age structures? So we discussed standardization and life table. This part here, that's usually where people have more trouble and they really don't do well in the exam, right? So life table is maybe the hardest topic that students encounter in this course. And I have two sets of like subgroups of slides here in this lecture related to life table. We'll talk about the first one, and that's the only one that will be considered in the exams. The second one is just extra material, right? And then just give you a short history of mortality in the world, talk about trends and causes of death, how causes of death changes, and they are different across countries. Also talk about mortality and longevity in the US, focus a little bit in infant mortality, and exactly because of this infant mortality is that I put that article. Infant mortality is mortality of people, babies, dying before reaching age 1. Child mortality can be to 5 up to 15 specific indicators. And that chapter of that article in the New York Times focus on child mortality, so related to this discussion. Future course of mortality is a final topic in the chapter about mortality in the textbook. And then this material here about the pandemic is similar to what I used at the beginning of this semester, but then I add some other trends of the pandemic by subgroups of the population that I did not show before. And I also just updated the numbers based on today's date, right? March 29th, right? So now going through this, the impact of mortality varies significantly according to social and demographic characteristics. So older people have higher chance of dying, but children, babies before reaching age 1 have higher chance of dying as well. Sex, on average, men are more likely to die than women in any age group. Race, ethnicity, you have a lot of variation in mortality by race, ethnicity here in the US. For example, African Americans having the higher levels of mortality, Asians having really low levels of mortality, and also non-Hispanic whites. Social class, richer people, lower chances of dying than people with lower socioeconomic status. Married people have better socioeconomic condition and have better health, lower chances of dying than other groups, than people with other marital statuses. Area of residence, people in urban areas have lower chances of dying than people living in rural areas. We usually have this fantasy or that, oh, in rural areas, my grandparents, they just ate really organic food, the habits were completely different, people live longer. That's not what data shows, right? Previous years, people lived on average less than what they live right now. And overall, people in urban areas live longer than people in rural areas because of better availability of better life standard for housing, for food, for health services, and so on. Just yesterday, I was watching, by coincidence, the local news. How is it called? The local channel here, KBTX. And they were talking about, and they were giving the example exactly about Texas, a specific community in Texas, a rural area, like a community that has like around 1,500 people living there. And they have really few hospitals around it that women can give birth. So the closest one, they have to drive 60 miles. And in other words, when a woman is going to labor, she's going to have to travel for at least 1 hour to get into a hospital where she can give birth. And if she gets there, that's not for sure that she's going to have a spot there. She would have to move to another place. And they were interviewing this woman who has already 2 children and is pregnant of a 3rd one. And she knows the situation. It's kind of like she has few chances to have prenatal care. And even giving birth is difficult. All that is related to area of residence and might have effect on mortality, both of the mother and the child that's being born, right? And this is here in Texas, right? right now, 2022, okay? So I'm giving you examples of things that are going on around us. Lee Creek Park and these rural communities. This is demography that's here around us, right? If you just pay attention, everything is about fertility, mortality, and migration, right? Levels of development, medical condition, and a host of other factors influence mortality. Influencing mortality that influences life expectancy, okay? So the idea is to discuss how mortality is estimated and then how it varies by all these social demographic characteristics. We have been seeing a change in causes of death, the reasons why people die the most. There have been major changes over the historical record in the main causes of death. People used to die mainly because of infectious and parasitic diseases. And today, the major causes of death in developed countries are heart disease, cancer, and stroke. And we already discussed that in the chapter about theories of demography when we focus on mortality. And I'm showing that the epidemiological transition, right? People used to die younger and because of infectious parasitic diseases. And now we live longer, and the main causes of death are heart disease, cancer, stroke, right? More chronic diseases. And then you have these variations because of the pandemic, right? Now we have infectious disease, communicable disease, affecting the mortality levels in the contemporary society all over the world. And in the US, a developed country, affecting life expectancy, according to estimates, between 1.5 and 2 years of life on average, decline from 2019 to 2020. And that's crazy. Major causes of death are different in countries with high and low levels of life expectancy, right? So countries that have high life expectancy, people live longer. The major causes of death are related to chronic diseases. In countries with low levels of life expectancy, high mortality, the incidence of infectious and parasitic diseases is higher. Cool? How do we measure mortality? So I just talked here about these basic concepts. And if you go back to the chapter about theories of demography, this discussion about cause of death, we discussed that a lot there as well in the epidemiological transition theory. I think it was in that chapter that I showed the graph of broken down causes of death by the little people. Remember that graph? By countries, like less developed countries, mid-developed countries, and more developed countries. So it's good to take a look back in these slides in the textbook. So how do we measure mortality? So the idea here is to do the same thing as we did in fertility, right? In fertility, I showed you how to estimate fertility rates, reproduction rates, and then afterwards show examples of those rates. Same thing that I'm going to do here now. So quantification of fertility, mortality, and migration is central in demography. And here we are talking about mortality. Measurement of mortality dates back to John Grant, the father of demography, that in his analysis called the bills of mortality. He got data from London, historical London, and he could break it by age and sex. And he was the first one trying to understand the trends of mortality by age, sex, place of residence, right? Mortality refers to the relative frequency of death in a population. And in mortality, we have these two main concepts, lifespan and life expectancy. Lifespan is the numerical age limit that we can reach of life, right? The maximum recorded age at death. I mean, this French woman, Jeanne-Louise Calment, she according to the records, she lived for a total of 122 years and 164 days. There are some, this example is cited in the textbook. There is a recent article in debate kind of like contesting this specific example, but it just gives us an idea of how much we could reach as human beings if all conditions are there socially, but also genetically, right? So lifespan is this maximum age in which we can live, and that's not the main focus of demographers. Demographers usually focus more on life expectancy, the average expected number of years of life to be lived by a particular population at a given time. Based on the mortality rates by age group in a specific population, broken down by sex, how much we would expect people to live under those conditions. Mortality rates broken down by age and sex, we calculate life expectancy to get this average expected number of years of life if people were exposed to those mortality rates. So the easiest rate to talk about mortality is the crude death rate that we already mentioned here before. The crude death rate, we get the number of deaths in a specific population in a year and divide by the population in the middle of that year and multiply by 1,000 because otherwise this number would be too small. So that's pretty much how many people died relative to the overall size of the population for every 1,000 people. So in the US, back in 2013, out of 316 million people, 2.5 million died. So that means 8.2 people died for every 1,000 population in the US. And these numbers for example, the United Arab Emirates and Qatar is only 1. Lesotho, 21. Wow. So these Middle Eastern countries, much better life conditions and mortality than the US. Not necessarily, because the American population is older than the population of the United Arab Emirates and Qatar. United Arab Emirates and Qatar have a higher proportion of people in younger ages, in labor ages, in which mortality rates are lower. So that's why comparing crude death rates across countries that have different age structures is not appropriate, right? And we're going to deal with this here now. So when crude death rates are compared among countries, differences are sometimes due to differences are sometimes due to differing age compositions, right? The previous examples that I just showed in the previous slide mean that there are 8 times more deaths per 1,000 people in the US than in the United Arab Emirates. Why is the crude death rate of the US 8 times higher than the one at UAE? The main reason is that the UAE is much younger on average. We have higher proportion of people in younger ages compared to the US. The US has high proportion of people above 65 years of age. And we know that younger people have lower death rates. So we have a crude death rate that's higher in the US because we have more older people proportionally than the UAE, and then the crude death rate is higher. So countries with large proportions of young people and small proportions of old people usually have lower crude death rates. That's the case of the UAE, United Arab Emirates. In the US, for example, that's a country with a small proportion of young people compared to others, larger proportions of old people. These countries usually have higher crude death rates, right? Because you have more people in older ages, they'll be more likely to die than younger people. So, and this I'm just talking about comparing the US with Qatar and United Arab Emirates, that we have to be concerned about different age structure. But even if we compare the US to itself across time, if the age structure has changed over time, in the US, for example, if we compare the crude death rate of the US in more recent years to previous decades, the analysis can be misleading. All right, so let's see an example. So crude death rates should not be used to compare the death experiences of the same population at different times, at different points in time, if the age structure has changed over time. So the US back in 1960 had a much younger population, higher proportion of people and younger ages and labor ages. In 2014, you have higher proportion of people in older ages. So compare the crude death rate between these two time points, it's not appropriate. If we compare the crude death rate in the US back in 1960 and 2014, we see that the crude death rate did not change as much. It dropped from only 9.5 to 8.2 deaths per 1,000 people. So what's going on here is that the crude death rate is not capable of capturing the reduction in mortality when the population becomes older. The US population became much older in 2014 compared to 1960. People are living longer now. The median age, for example, back in 1960 was 29. The median age now is 37 years, not now in 2014. So exactly because the population is getting older, you're comparing two time points that should not be compared because there is a change in age structure. So this is an example to show that it's not only when we compare countries with different age structures. If you compare the same country over time and that country change in age structure, you might get this misleading information that mortality did not improve too much, decline from only 9.5 to 8.2 deaths per 1,000 people. So why the crude death rate is called a crude rate? Because its denominator comprises the entire population. We are not subdividing the population by smaller age groups. But we know that people at different age groups have different chances of dying. Population members are not equally at the risk of experiencing death. We know that older people are more likely to die. And we actually know that men are more likely to die. We also know that African Americans are more likely to die. We also know that poor people are more likely to die, and several other factors. So in order to see the differences across the subgroups, we have to have mortality rates, not for the entire population. We should have mortality rates by age, by sex, by race, ethnicity, by socioeconomic status, and so on. Usually, this exercise of standardizing the crude death rate, we break it down by age group. We break down the mortality rates by age. When we do life expectancy at birth, we break it by both age and sex. And just to give an example by age, the death rates, the mortality rates vary a lot by age. So how do you capture that? We use death rates that are specific by age groups. So demographers use age-specific death rates as a more precise way to measure mortality. The idea is similar to the crude death rate. You get the number of people that died in a specific year divided by the population in that specific year multiplied by 1,000. But then you are talking about specific age groups, number of people who died between the ages of X to X plus N, divided by the population of people from ages X to X plus N. And then we get the mortality rate specific for each one of the age groups. And we multiply usually by 1,000 because this number would be also really small. The age-specific death rate can be symbolized here by the ASDR or by the capital M. And just to explain this notation again, similar to what I said before, for the age group going to 15 to 19, the initial age is 15. And the width of this age group is 5. We have 5 ages here, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19. The way that it's symbolized is M, 15, 5. So that's for the age group going from 15 to 19. Because this 5 here includes 15, okay? So we have to calculate mortality for each one of the age groups in order to compare mortality levels across populations that have different age structure. And this is an example of mortality rate by age groups. And mortality rates, they are usually much higher among children, among babies that die before reaching age 1 than those ones that die between the ages 1 to 4. So the first age group, we usually break it down. Those that die below age of 1, and then 1 to 4, and then we go every 5. 5 to 9, 10 to 14, 15, 19, until the last one. That's usually this open-ended interval, can be 85 plus, 100 plus, depending on availability of data. Here we are just zooming in to this portion of the graph just to show that there is significant variation. When we change the vertical axis here, the range, then we see this variation, high mortality, infant mortality, compared to the next group. And as people start to get older, chances of dying increases, and then it keeps increasing as they get older. So when we compare populations, for example, the US and the United Arab Emirates, that have different age structure, we should actually take into account that mortality varies by age group. Most of the population in the United Arab Emirates, they have higher proportion of the population compared to the US in younger ages in which mortality rates are smaller. The US have higher proportions of older people compared to the United Arab Emirates, in which the mortality, chance of dying are higher. So we have to take that into account in order to compare mortality across the societies. And how do we take that into account? That's what we do with standardization, and that's what we do with the life table to calculate the life expectancy at birth. So we take the age-specific death rates, the death rates for all those broken down age groups, and not the overall crude death rate, to compare mortality across societies that have different age compositions, okay? Let me just show you here some things. So just the structure of this chapter here. So in the next class, I will discuss the standardization. So these slides here, and then the life table that's how we estimate life expectancy for all age groups. And for each one of those, we have examples in Excel that you can download from here for standardization. Standardization, I have this example between the US and Venezuela, and life table is a life table for the US. And then here, this is the second portion that I mentioned. These slides here are extra. It's also about life table, but it's just from a different textbook, but we will cover more in detail up to here. And then I go into the same way as I did in the fertility chapter, some examples of mortality in the world, going from here to here, No, see, this was the graph that I thought that I had already shown to you. I don't know if I showed this graph before. Here we have the causes of death for low-income countries, middle-income countries, and high-income countries. In low-income countries, there is a higher incidence of deaths because of infectious diseases, while in high-income countries, there is a higher incidence of deaths due to chronic diseases. So this is related to that slide that I mentioned to you guys before. And then you keep going. Mortality in the US, infant mortality, discussion about future causes of mortality and some trends of the current pandemic, right? So it's 12:25 now. I will continue on this chapter about mortality on Thursday. So thank you very much, and I see you then.